It's called The Nazi Persecution of Homosexuals, 1933 to 1945. Paragraph 175 allowed them to do was to restrict even the social gathering of people.
In Nazi Germany, sexuality was tightly controlled and manipulated to further the objectives of the state. This period saw the imposition of strict norms, the promotion of a supposed ideal family structure, and the ruthless persecution of those who deviated from the prescribed standards. This video unveils 15 often undiscussed aspects of sexuality in Nazi Germany, shedding light on the harrowing policies and conditions that shaped human relationships and experiences during this dark chapter of history. Number 1. Nazi policies on homosexuality. During the reign of the Nazi regime, a draconian crackdown on homosexuality, primarily targeting homosexual men, was instituted as a part of a broader agenda to preserve the perceived purity of the Aryan race. Homosexual acts between men were criminalized under the revised paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. In an attempt to eradicate homosexuality, which was viewed as a threat to the racial purity and population growth, the Gestapo created a special division, the Reich Central Office for the Combating of Homosexuality and Abortion, intensifying the scrutiny and prosecution of homosexual individuals. Contrary to the established pre-Nazi Weimar culture, which was somewhat tolerant towards homosexuality, the Nazis sought to cultivate a hyper-masculine, militarized society, wherein they considered homosexuality as a sign of weakness and a potential corrupting influence. Under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, the Nazi regime implemented a series of brutal policies targeting homosexual men, involving systematic identification, humiliation, and often sending them to concentration camps where they were subjected to forced labor, medical experiments, and mass executions. Homosexual men were marked with a pink triangle badge, a symbol that became a tool of dehumanization and a marker for harsher treatment compared to other prisoners. The Nazis' policies on homosexuality were not just restricted to Germany, but were also implemented in the occupied territories during the Second World War, bringing untold misery and death to thousands. This brutal campaign against homosexuality stands as a testament to the Nazi regime's broader campaign of violence, suppression, and the imposition of narrow, ideologically driven norms on human sexuality. Number 2. The role of women and the cult of motherhood. In the totalitarian grip of the Nazi regime, the role of women was insidiously confined to fostering the growth and purity of the Aryan race. The Nazis propagated a rigid gender role dichotomy which rested heavily on the cult of motherhood. Women were expected to embrace their roles as mothers and caretakers, relegated to the private sphere of home and family, where they could nurture the next generation of pure-blooded Aryans. The Nazi regime actively discouraged women from pursuing careers, and educational opportunities for women were substantially curtailed to funnel them into domestic roles. Simultaneously, there was a concerted effort to control and regulate women's bodies and reproductive rights in adherence to the racial doctrines propagated by the Nazis. Women were discouraged and sometimes forcibly prevented from marrying men considered racially inferior, and those relationships that did not align with the Nazi racial ideology were often dissolved. In extreme cases, the regime resorted to forced sterilizations to prevent the transmission of perceived undesirable traits. This narrowed conceptualization of women's roles in Nazi Germany not only deeply entrenched gender disparities, but also fostered a culture that instrumentalized women's bodies and reproductive capacities for the demographic ambitions of a totalitarian state, leaving an indelible mark on the lives and experiences of women during this period. Number 3. The Lebensborn Program and Racial Purity. The Lebensborn Program, initiated by Heinrich Himmler in 1935, was a sinister project grounded in the Nazi obsession with racial purity and the propagation of the Aryan bloodline. Designed as a means to increase the birth rate of pure Aryan children, it facilitated secretive, systematic breeding practices that exploited the principles of Nazi racial theory. Himmler envisaged the program as a beacon of the Nazi vision of racial purity, aiming to create a generation that epitomized the Aryan ideal, both in physical attributes and ideological alignment. At the heart of this program were Lebensborn homes, facilities where selected women who met the stringent racial criteria set by the Nazis could give birth to children fathered by SS men, in secrecy and away from the public eye. These homes were not just birthing facilities, but also operated as orphanages where children, deemed to be racially pure, were nurtured to become the future bearers of the Nazi ideology. These children were often forcibly taken from other countries, particularly from Eastern Europe, under policies of Germanization, wherein they were indoctrinated into Nazi beliefs and completely cut off from their biological families and cultural roots. Despite its ambitious objectives, the Lebensborn program remains a dark testament to the extent of the Nazis' racial obsession, a horrifying manifestation of their eugenics policies, and an assault on human dignity and individual rights, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and stolen identities that survivors grappled with long after the fall of the Third Reich. Number 4. Suppression and control of sex education. In the totalitarian structure of Nazi Germany, the realm of sex education was not spared from the pervasive influence of the regime's ideologies. The Nazis sought to suppress and control sex education to further their objectives of fostering racial purity and promoting the sanctity of the traditional family unit. Under their regime, sex education became an instrument of state propaganda, carefully orchestrated to instill the youth with values that aligned with Nazi racial and moral doctrines. Under the Nazi education system, young people were indoctrinated with a warped narrative on sexuality that idolized racial purity and procreative sex within the confines of marriage. They were taught to view sexual relations primarily as a means of reproduction, a duty to contribute to the growth of the Aryan race. The regime discouraged relationships between Germans and those who were considered racially undesirable, fostering xenophobia and racial prejudice from an early age. Simultaneously, the Nazis utilized sex education as a tool to delineate clear gender roles, reinforcing the belief that women's primary function was to be mothers and caretakers, thus instilling a patriarchal mindset that sought to control and limit women's agency and aspirations. This period of suppression and control in the sphere of sex education represents a significant regression in the discourse on sexuality in Germany. A manipulation of education to serve the interests of a totalitarian regime characterized by the propagation of prejudiced beliefs and the curtailment of individual freedoms and knowledge. Number 5. The persecution of homosexuals. The Nazi regime, driven by an ideology steeped in hatred and a twisted vision of purity, unleashed an era of severe persecution against homosexuals, predominantly targeting gay men. This gruesome chapter in history is marked by unimaginable horrors and brutalities as the Nazis sought to eradicate what they perceived as a threat to the Aryan race's purity and propagation. This objective was institutionally enforced through the ruthless alteration of paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, which criminalized homosexual acts between males, marking the onset of a systematic campaign of repression and violence. Apart from physical atrocities, homosexuals faced a societal death, with their reputations tarnished and families torn apart in the relentless pursuit of the Nazis' perverse version of a pure society. Efforts were also made to reform them, with many being subjected to cruel and unfounded medical procedures in an attempt to cure their homosexuality, a testament to the deeply entrenched homophobia that characterized this period. Meanwhile, lesbian women, although not prosecuted to the same extent as gay men, found their lives constricted within the rigid gender roles prescribed by the regime, which sought to control their reproductive abilities and coerce them into fulfilling their duty of motherhood, erasing their identities and forcing them into a life of conformity and silence. This period stands as a horrifying testament to the depths of human cruelty, a dark era where love and identity were criminalized, and thousands suffered unimaginably under a regime fueled by hatred and bigotry. Number 6. Sterilization programs. The sterilization programs enacted during the Nazi regime represent a stark manifestation of the horrifying lengths to which the pursuit of racial purity was taken. Anchored in the deeply flawed principles of eugenics, these programs were initiated with the intention to prevent the procreation of individuals whom the Nazis deemed as carriers of hereditary diseases or undesirable genetic traits, seeking to engineer a population that conformed to their Aryan ideal. As the regime intensified its stranglehold, the categories of individuals subjected to these programs expanded, engulfing those who did not conform to the Nazis' stringent racial and ideological criteria. Jews, Romani people, and others who were seen as racially or ethnically inferior found themselves targeted, their basic human right to bear children cruelly snatched away under the guise of genetic health. These sterilizations were carried out through various methods including surgery and radiation, often conducted without consent and with a complete disregard for the individual's well-being. The victims of these programs endured unimaginable physical and psychological trauma, their lives marred by the violation of their bodily autonomy and the crushing of their dreams to have families. The sterilization programs stand as a glaring example of the cruelty and inhumanity that characterized the Nazi regime. A vile experiment in social engineering, these programs inflicted irreversible harm on countless individuals, leaving behind a legacy of pain, broken families, and shattered lives, marking a dark chapter in human history where the sanctity of life was wantonly disregarded in the pursuit of a perverse ideological goal. Number 7. The influence of Nazi ideology on gender roles and relations. The Nazi regime's influence on gender roles and relations was deep-rooted, establishing a firm grasp on society's fabric, sculpting ideologies that sought to cement a hierarchical order grounded in patriarchal dominance and racial purity. The Nazis constructed a rigid framework within which men and women were expected to operate, each confined to roles that served the ulterior motives of the regime, propagating their Aryan ideal and sustaining their totalitarian rule. Conversely, women were relegated to a more confined sphere, their roles tightly knit around the family and the household. The Nazi propaganda machine painted the ideal German woman as a devoted wife and mother, responsible for nurturing the future generation of racially pure Aryan children. Their aspirations and potentials were stifled, their educations curtailed, and career prospects severely limited to encourage them to embrace motherhood as their supreme duty. This division created a polarized society where gender relations were strained, defined by power imbalances and a perpetuation of traditional gender norms. Relationships were under scrutiny, with the state exerting influence on personal choices to ensure they aligned with the Nazis' racial and moral doctrines. Marriages were encouraged between racially pure couples, fostering unions that were anticipated to produce the perfect offspring, thus wielding control over the most intimate aspects of individuals' lives. Through this structured and coercive manipulation of gender roles and relations, the Nazi regime sought to craft a society that functioned as a cog in their grand machine of racial supremacy and totalitarian control, leaving an indelible scar on the personal freedoms and dynamics of human relationships during this dark period. Number 8. Medical experiments in sexuality. In their relentless pursuit of racial supremacy and military dominance, the Nazi regime engaged in a series of brutal medical experiments, exploiting thousands of individuals in concentration camps as subjects in torturous studies that delved into various aspects of human biology, including sexuality. These experiments, driven by a perverse curiosity and complete disregard for human dignity, represented the darkest aspects of Nazi science, where the lines between research and torture were indelibly blurred. This sinister pursuit extended to efforts to increase the Aryan birth rate through methods such as artificial insemination and other procedures that sought to maximize the reproduction of those considered racially superior. Concurrently, efforts were undertaken to prevent the reproduction of those labeled as racially or genetically inferior, deploying sterilization techniques that left many unable to bear children, their reproductive rights ruthlessly stripped away. Moreover, the Nazis embarked on a campaign of sexual violence and coercion, using sexuality as a weapon of control and humiliation, where women, in particular, were subjected to rape and forced prostitution in military brothels, a chilling testament to the regime's systematic degradation of human dignity. These heinous experiments stand as a somber reminder of the depths of cruelty and dehumanization that marked the Nazi era, where the sanctity of human life was discarded, and individuals were reduced to mere subjects in a grotesque experiment that sought to manipulate the very essence of human existence in the service of a barbaric and inhumane ideology. Number 9. Propagation of the ideal Aryan family image. Under the oppressive reign of the Nazi regime, the meticulous crafting and propagation of the ideal Aryan family image became a centerpiece in their sprawling propaganda machine. This manufactured narrative was employed as a potent tool to foster unity, compliance, and adherence to the values that the Nazis held sacrosanct: racial purity, familial duty, and absolute loyalty to the state. Through various mediums, films, posters, literature, a stark image was painted, portraying the Aryan family as the epitome of perfection and the bedrock of the new German society. In contrast, women were depicted in nurturing roles, often showcased in domestic settings, engrossed in the tasks of homemaking or tending to their offspring, their images carefully constructed to exude a sense of maternal warmth and devotion. The portrayal emphasized their duty to bear and raise Aryan children, thus serving as vessels for the propagation of a racially pure future generation. Children, on the other hand, were depicted as cherubic figures, the bearers of the hopes and dreams of the Third Reich. Images often showcased them in harmonious settings, sometimes donning uniforms of the Hitler Youth, indicating the regime's intent to mold them into loyal followers, ingraining them with Nazi values from an early age. This constructed imagery of the Aryan family served a dual purpose: to instill a sense of pride and aspiration among the German populace, urging them to conform to this perceived ideal, and to underscore a divisive narrative that sought to alienate and vilify those who did not fit into this carefully crafted tableau, reinforcing the dangerous rhetoric of racial superiority and fostering a society steeped in prejudice and hatred. Number 10. Homosexuality and the SA, Sturmabteilung leadership. The Sturmabteilung SA, also known as the Stormtroopers or Brown Shirts, played a significant role in the rise of the Nazi Party. During the early years of the regime, the relationship between homosexuality and the SA leadership became a point of contention, intrigue, and manipulation. The leadership of the SA, particularly its chief, Ernst Röhm, was known for its relatively open approach towards homosexuality, a stark contrast to the stringent homophobic stance adopted by the broader Nazi regime. Ernst Röhm, a close ally of Hitler in the early years, was openly homosexual. His stance towards homosexuality in the SA was perceived as an anomaly within the Nazi structure, which was deeply rooted in homophobic ideologies, seeing homosexuality as a threat to the propagation of the Aryan race. The SA itself had a substantial number of gay men within its ranks, and Röhm's leadership seemed for a time to offer a protective umbrella for them. Following this purge, the Nazi regime intensified its crusade against homosexuality, ushering in an era of persecution and terror for the homosexual community in Germany. The SA, once a space where homosexuality could exist with a certain degree of openness, transformed into an entity that aligned firmly with the Nazi ideology, echoing its vehement homophobia and playing a role in the widespread persecution of homosexuals that would darken the years to come, illustrating the duplicitous and manipulative nature of the Nazi regime's power dynamics and policies. Number 11. Prostitution during the Nazi era. During the Nazi era, the landscape of prostitution underwent a significant transformation, reflecting the regime's conflicting stances on sexuality and control. Initially, the Nazis sought to eradicate prostitution, viewing it as a vice that undermined the racial purity and moral fabric of the German society. Their policies targeted both the providers and patrons of such services, aiming to cleanse the nation of what they perceived as moral decadence. The women who were ensnared in this grim network of state-sanctioned prostitution were diverse in their backgrounds, encompassing a range of nationalities and ethnicities, including German women and women from occupied territories. These women were subjected to regular medical examinations, a policy implemented under the guise of protecting the German troops from diseases, revealing the Nazi regime's cold, calculative approach to human exploitation. Furthermore, The streets of German cities and towns witnessed a surge in clandestine prostitution as the economic hardships of the war propelled many women into offering sexual services for survival. The Nazi authorities continuously fought to suppress these activities, viewing them as a threat to their vision of a racially and morally pure society. The contradictory policies surrounding prostitution during the Nazi era exposed the deep-seated hypocrisy and inhumanity of the regime, which exploited the very vices it claimed to despise, commodifying human bodies for the perceived benefit of their militaristic objectives, leaving in their wake a trail of broken lives and violated dignity. Number 12. Sexuality and concentration camps. In the grim reality of Nazi concentration camps, sexuality became a tool of degradation, punishment, and control. The camps, which were already sites of unimaginable human suffering and cruelty, witnessed the perversion of sexuality as a means to further oppress and torment the prisoners. The SS guards and administrators exerted brutal control over every aspect of the prisoners' lives, including their sexuality. Acts of sexual violence and abuse were commonplace, with guards exploiting their positions of power to sexually assault and harass inmates. Female prisoners in particular were frequently subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence, a chilling representation of the regime's ruthless dehumanization of those they considered inferior. In addition to individual acts of sexual violence, the Nazi authorities implemented policies that sought to manipulate the reproductive capacities of the inmate population. For instance, forced sterilizations were conducted on those deemed unworthy of reproduction, a horrifying intrusion into the most personal aspects of an individual's life, carried out in the name of preserving racial purity. The Nazis also engaged in cruel and unethical medical experiments involving sexuality and reproduction. These experiments, conducted without the consent of the participants, aimed at furthering the Nazis' perverse theories on race and biology. Victims were subjected to invasive procedures, often resulting in severe pain, injury, or death. The narrative of sexuality within the concentration camps is a complex and harrowing one, showcasing the depths of human cruelty and the capacity for resilience and solidarity even in the darkest of times. Number 13. The Pink Triangle, symbol of persecution. In the chilling landscape of Nazi concentration camps, symbols became tools of classification and persecution, and none is more synonymous with homosexual suffering during this era than the Pink Triangle. Initially instituted as a means to label and shame, the Pink Triangle was forcibly stitched onto the uniforms of individuals arrested and interned for the crime of homosexuality, marking them as targets for heightened brutality and discrimination within the camp system. Furthermore, these individuals were often isolated from the rest of the prisoner population, a segregation that served to amplify their suffering by denying them the support and solidarity that could sometimes be found among other groups of inmates. Their isolation was a testament to the Nazis' successful campaign of dehumanization, which saw them excluded even in communities of fellow sufferers. But history has a way of reclaiming symbols of oppression, and in the years following the end of World War II, the Pink Triangle was transformed from a marker of persecution into a symbol of defiance and solidarity. It has been adopted by the LGBTQ+ community as a powerful reminder of the past atrocities and as a rallying emblem in the ongoing fight for equal rights and recognition. The Pink Triangle, once a tool of Nazi oppression, has been redefined as a beacon of resilience, a symbol that bears witness to the darkest corners of history while lighting the path towards a more inclusive and empathetic future. Number 14. Racial hygiene and eugenic policies, impact on sexuality. The concept of racial hygiene deeply influenced the Nazi regime's approach to sexuality, as it formed the linchpin of their brutal eugenic policies aimed at cultivating a racially pure Aryan populace. This fixation on racial purity permeated every aspect of life, dictating who could engage in sexual relations and reproduce, and under what conditions. Central to this ideology was the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, enacted in 1933, which mandated the compulsory sterilization of individuals deemed to be carriers of hereditary illnesses, including mental illness and physical disabilities. This invasive policy was an affront to personal autonomy, stripping individuals of their right to have children based on a perverse understanding of genetic superiority. Furthermore, the Nazis engaged in programs aimed at encouraging the birth of racially pure Aryan children. Aryan women were encouraged, and sometimes coerced, to bear children, even outside of wedlock, if it served the purpose of increasing the Aryan population. Programs like Lebensborn provided support for pregnant women with Aryan features to give birth and raise children who would, in theory, replenish and strengthen the Germanic race. Thus, the racial hygiene and eugenic policies of the Nazis twisted the natural aspects of human sexuality, turning it into a controlled and manipulated facet of their tyrannical regime, seeking to engineer a society that matched their warped and deeply prejudiced vision of human perfection. It remains a chilling testament to the depths of cruelty and oppression that can be reached when unfettered power meets perverse ideology. Number 15. Nazi art and propaganda, representations of sexuality. In the realm of Nazi art and propaganda, sexuality was wielded as a potent tool to promote their vision of a racially superior society and to marginalize those they deemed undesirable. The representations of sexuality were tightly controlled, propagating a dual narrative that both glorified the Aryan physique and demonized the sexual characteristics of other groups. In Nazi art, the Aryan body was represented as the epitome of physical perfection, highlighting traits that were considered to be racially pure and superior. These depictions often showcased Aryan men as strong, muscular, and heroic, embodying the martial spirit that the regime valorized. Aryan women, on the other hand, were often depicted as nurturing figures, embodiments of fertility and motherhood, destined to birth and rear the next generation of Aryan progeny. These representations aimed to ingrain the ideals of racial purity in the populace, fostering a culture that revered the Aryan body and sexuality as superior. Furthermore, the regime sought to suppress any form of artistic expression that did not align with their narrow vision of sexuality. Modern art, which often explored sexuality in diverse and unconventional ways, was branded as degenerate and was subject to strict censorship and bans. Artists who did not conform to the Nazi ideals were ostracized, their works destroyed or displayed in degenerate art exhibitions, which sought to ridicule and diminish the value of such creations. Through this meticulous control and manipulation of sexual representations in art and propaganda, the Nazis aimed to reshape the societal perceptions of sexuality, steering it to align with their perverted vision of racial hierarchy and purity, leaving a legacy of distorted and hateful imagery that would echo through history.